This is a real-life story based on one of America's most dangerous gangsters who managed to turn federal agents into his allies. For years he evaded justice, considering himself untouchable. But the more powerful he became, the closer was the day when his empire would begin to crumble. On an autumn evening in 1975, three men approach a bar in South Boston, but the bouncer does not allow them to enter, because last time one of them peed right on the wall of the institution. Charlie believes that some guard has no right to tell him, and a fight ensues between them. At the same time, Jimmy Bulger is sitting in a bar and asks John to stop sticking his greasy fingers in a bowl that everyone uses. Soon Mike approaches him and asks him to go outside. There Jimmy sees the security guard of the institution fighting with three men at once. He orders the fight to stop and takes Charlie inside. And Kevin finds out that he just got into a fight with Bulger's cousin's husband. The next morning, Jimmy orders Kevin to get in the car and go out of town, where he unexpectedly realizes that he has to take part in beating a stranger. So Kevin ends up in Bulger's gang and starts knocking out debts. Federal Bureau of Investigation agent John Connolly grew up in the same neighborhood and, as a child, was friends with William Bulger, Jimmy's brother. Having been assigned to the Boston branch of the Bureau, he intends to deal with the Italian Mafia, which is led by Gennaro Angelo. John meets with William, who has become a senator of Massachusetts, and during the conversation reminds him that the confrontation between Jimmy and Angelo's people continues in Boston, and he himself came here precisely to fight the Mafia. Connolly wants William to arrange a meeting with his brother. However, the senator refuses, stressing that he has nothing to do with Jimmy's affairs. If Jimmy wants to contact you, he'll find you. Despite this, William still tells his brother about the Federals' offer during a meeting at his mother's house. And Jimmy agrees to talk to a man who, as a child, looked at him with admiration. During the meeting, John informs that according to the Bureau, Gennaro is preparing an attempt on Jimmy. And he is ready to tell exactly how the Mafia is going to do it, but in return, he demands a favor. This isn't Jimmy's ratting. It's a union. Connolly suggests joining forces and clearing the streets of Sophie from the influence of the Italian Mafia. However, the very idea of cooperating with the Fed offends Bulger, and he rejects the offer. Jimmy has a son whose existence he tries not to advertise. And if the boy's mother prefers to keep him out of trouble, Jimmy himself thinks otherwise. In his opinion, it is impossible to avoid all fights, so it is much more important to learn how to get out of them, so that no one notices anything. If no one saw it, it didn't happen. The police also play a significant role in the confrontation between the groups. One day, Officer Flynn sends Jimmy greetings from Angel, who does not like that one of the Italian Mafia people was beaten up. Through a policeman, Angelo warns Bulger that if this happens again, he will not escape serious trouble. However, Jimmy is outraged that his countryman takes the side of the Italians and reminds Flynn that such a position can cost him dearly. "I wouldn't have warned you if I wanted to kill you, you stupid thing." Tommy is furious that some policeman allows himself to talk to them in such a tone and offers to kill Flynn. But Bulger forbids even thinking about it. Then Tommy snaps at Jimmy and insults the leader. The conflict is extinguished, but Bulger does not forget anything. Meanwhile, Angela decides to take tougher measures and gives the order to kill Mickey. The next day, Jimmy drives up to the bar and asks Tommy to get in the car. He explains that they need to find the person who framed Mickey. On the way, Tommy regrets yesterday's conversation and apologizes for his behavior. Soon the car stops in a vacant lot, where Tommy once again apologizes for what happened. And soon after, Jimmy contacts John. Encouraged that Bulger has agreed to cooperate with the Bureau, Connolly reports this to management. However, Charles McGuire opposes. He believes that the Bureau should not have any dealings with a person who eliminates everyone who is suspected of betrayal. But John continues to insist on his own. He convinces the management that he has known Jimmy since childhood, and if he gives his word, he keeps it. Connolly is sure that it is worth using any available means to destroy the Italian Mafia, and in the end, he manages to convince Charles of the need to cooperate with Bulger. That evening, John meets with Jimmy and informs him that the management has approved the union. But on one condition: no murders. After learning this news about Jimmy, Stephen disapproves of her, because it's shameful to work with the feds. However, the leader convinces him that they are at war with the Italian mafia, which means that the bureau can be used in their own interests. It's not snitching when you frame the bastards who deserve it. After a while, Bulger decides to spend the day with his son, but Lindsay informs him that Douglas is ill. And soon, during the Christmas dinner at William's house, the news comes. The boy ended up in the hospital. Jimmy visits his son and learns from Lindsay that the child has been diagnosed with Ray's syndrome, and he is in critical condition. Doctors no longer hope for a miracle and support his life only with the help of devices. Lindsay can't bear to look at her son's suffering and decides to turn off the life support system. Bulger is not ready to accept this, but he can't change anything anymore. After the death of his son and the beginning of cooperation with the feds, his influence begins to grow rapidly. Law enforcement agencies practically stop bothering him, and the gang's income increases every year. Jimmy earns money on drugs, bookmaking, slot machines, and other illegal schemes. And in order for the business to work without interruptions, he gradually gets local officials and police officers hooked on bribes. However, years pass, and Bulger's information does not help to destroy the Italian mafia. This causes constant conflicts between John and Charles. He is convinced that Bulger is simply using the bureau to his advantage and demands results. Maguire gives Connolly 2 weeks to set up a wiretap at Angelo's headquarters. Upon learning about this, Jimmy promises to help, but in return demands that Angelo's slot machines disappear from the area. He's not interested. That's the way the feds will achieve it. The next morning, John gets into the car and realizes that Bulger has kept his word. There he is already waiting for photos of Angel and his closest people leaving the building on Prince Street. Connolly shows the pictures to the management and emphasizes that Jimmy turns out to be more reliable than many informants. That the bureau has been paying for years. An hour ago, I was shaving in a barber shop right across from 98 in the heart of the North End. And soon the feds infiltrate Angel's headquarters and set up a wiretap. Thanks to the bureau's patronage, Jimmy's influence is gradually spreading far beyond Boston. His people enter the betting business in Florida and invest in a company that eventually begins to bring in serious money. However, the new head of the company, Roger Wheeler, refuses to deal with Bulger's people. Callahan warns Jimmy that Wheeler may notice the disappearance of large sums from circulation, and then they will have serious problems. During the discussion, Bulger offers to get rid of the businessman, and then negotiate with his widow about selling the company on favorable terms. Realizing that Brian is present during the conversation, whom he does not really trust, he asks him to take the money and forget everything that was said that evening. And some time later, Wheeler is killed in a parking lot near a golf club in Florida. Roger Wheeler. Meanwhile, thanks to listening to conversations between gangsters, the feds get information about Bulger's involvement in Wheeler's murder. Agent Maurice believes that Jimmy violated the terms of cooperation, and now the Bureau has reason to terminate any relationship with him. However, Connolly is not going to lose his informant. He convinces Maurice not to jump to conclusions and promises to remove the audio recording from the case, continuing to cover Bulger. After killing Wheeler, Brian begins to realize how dangerous his situation is becoming. He was present at the conversation at which the elimination of the businessman was discussed, and now he fears that one day Bulger will get rid of him as well. And not wanting to wait for his turn, he turns to the Bureau. Brian declares that he is ready to tell everything he knows in exchange for protection and recounts in detail the conversation he witnessed. I was sitting and just thinking about my own, when suddenly Elahan says that maybe Wheeler will be a problem. And then Jimmy says, "Do you think his widow will want to sell the company?" But Connolly is doing everything possible to discredit his testimony. He exposes Brian as a liar and a man who himself may be involved in the crime, and now he's just trying to save his own skin. In the end, he manages to convince Maurice of this, and Brian is left without protection. John later meets Jimmy, who denies any involvement in Wheeler's murder. He claims that he did not even know the businessman, although he had a stake in his company. From Connolly, Bulger learns that Brian told the feds about a conversation where Wheeler's elimination was discussed. And soon Jimmy, in his usual manner, kills the informant, making his death an indicative warning for the others. The fact that he actually refused to protect the witness and informed Bulger about Brian's visit. Now he is dead, but the heated argument interrupts the important news. Thanks to wiretapping at Angelo's headquarters, the feds receive evidence of his involvement in bookmaking, drug trafficking, and other crimes. And the next day, John personally takes part in the detention of the head of the mafia. While the feds celebrate their success, Jimmy and his men celebrate the fall of a longtime enemy. It is then that he decides to get rid of Callahan, who knows too much about the gang's affairs. During one of the family dinners, Mary notices that John began to live clearly with spontaneity. Expensive suits, gold watches, and a new lifestyle cause her more and more suspicions. She is sure that friendship with Bulger has a bad effect on her husband and asks to stay away from him. Keep him away. But John doesn't want to listen to anything and insists that Jimmy is just an informant who helps him fight crime and get promoted. You married a guy from the street, and the street taught me to be true to my friends. In 1985, the Bulger brothers' mother died. Jimmy is going through this loss hard because it was she who always remained the main person in his life. To distract himself from grief, he plunges deeper into the gang's affairs and continues to support representatives of the Irish Republican Army, promising to help them with the supply of weapons. One day, Stephen reports that his girlfriend's daughter Deborah has been called in for questioning by the police. The girl knows too much about the gang's activities, and Jimmy's suspicion prevails over common sense. He asks Deborah about the conversation with the police, and she assures him that she did not tell anything, because she understands the consequences perfectly. But this is not enough for Bulger, and after bringing the girl to one of his houses, he kills her with his own hand. And just a few hours later, Stephen, along with Jimmy, as if nothing had happened, goes to dinner at John's. Mary is still dissatisfied with her husband's friendship with the gangster and refuses to go out to the guests. When Jimmy notices her absence, he decides to go upstairs. And, despite John's explanation that his wife is not feeling well, he knocks on the bedroom door. When Mary opens up to him, he is interested in her well-being, and then unequivocally makes it clear that her dislike can create problems not only for herself, but also for her husband. John was very lucky. New federal prosecutor Fred Vashik is unhappy that Bouger is still at large. John tries to convince him that he has long retired from crime and is engaged in legal business. In addition, he recalls that Jimmy is the brother of William Bulger, one of the most influential politicians in Massachusetts. And numerous rumors around him are spread by detractors. But the prosecutor is not interested in this, and he demands that Connolly provide real evidence that Bulger is no longer engaged in criminal activity. After the conversation, John turns to William with a request to influence the prosecutor and force him to abandon the investigation. However, William understands that interference in the work of federal agencies can cost him his career, and asks not to contact him with such requests anymore. Meanwhile, McGuire learns a curious detail from Agent Fitzpatrick. The information that Bulger transmits regularly arrives late, while data from another source turns up at the Bureau. Almost instantly, it becomes obvious that Connolly himself provides Bulger with information, and Bulger passes it off as his own information. There are more and more problems. A ship with a shipment of weapons for the Irish rebels does not have time to leave the territorial waters of America, and is intercepted by the Customs Service. It turns out that one of the crew members cooperated with law enforcement agencies. When John tries to find out his name from Fitzpatrick, he refuses to answer, perfectly remembering the fate of Brian, who was killed shortly after communicating with the feds. What is happening is increasingly disturbing Maurice. He realizes how deeply they are mired in ties with Bulger, and begins to fear that one day he will be in the dock with him. McGuire's going to Washington, do you understand that? And he will bring up the cases of all the informants, while the prosecutor sleeps and sees how he will hang our scalps on his wall. We're fucked. John tries to calm down his colleague and reminds him that thanks to cooperation with Jimmy, they managed to destroy the Italian mafia and solve many crimes. But for Maurice, these excuses no longer mean anything, because he is sure that their system is about to collapse. The next day, Vashik calls John to him. Another informant has disappeared without a trace, and the prosecutor is increasingly alarmed by a strange pattern. Every time the investigation gets close to Bulger, witnesses suddenly disappear. At the same time, Stephen and Kevin bring a witness to Jimmy. He admits that he cooperated with the feds and transmitted information about the supply of weapons. And after listening to his confession, Bulger does not hesitate to kill the informant. Meanwhile, Maurice, fearing that he will be made the main culprit of the entire scheme of cooperation with Bulger, begins to communicate with journalists and revealing details of long-term ties between the gangster and federal agents. And soon Jimmy sees an article that says that for many years he was an informant of the Bureau. Kevin can't believe what he's written, and Bulger convinces him that he never worked for the government. He recalls how much money he handed over to the feds and personally to Maurice, who has managed to arrange his life well over the years. Is that what informants do? Meanwhile, Vashik finds new witnesses who are ready to tell everything they know about Bulger in exchange for protection. Their testimony turns out to be enough to start arrests of people from his entourage, including Stephen Flemmi and John Connolly. Realizing that the ring around him is shrinking, Jimmy calls his brother and says goodbye to him, after which he gets into the car and disappears. Many participants in this story have made deals with the investigation, received deadlines, or agreed to cooperate with the authorities. John Connolly himself was convicted for his role in the criminal scheme and went to prison. And James Bulger managed to hide from justice for another 12 years. Only in 2011, an anonymous call helped to get on his trail in California. The court found him guilty of numerous murders and sentenced him to 2 life terms. As you morons haven't realized yet, it's just at the beginning. Jimmy was a small businessman who had weight only in the South. Don't get me wrong, he was a tough bastard, but a small fry. And suddenly he became a big mover. And why? Because the FBI allowed it.